on is the application of philosophy to computer science.
Could you tell me more about that application?
Sure. So, I mean, a little background. I got my first bachelor's degree in philosophy back in 2012 when I was 21 years old. And I went out into the workforce for a year, but realized that's not really where my interests lie. And I went back for a second bachelor's in computer science. There's a lot of applications of philosophy to computer science, and that philosophy is one of the basis for computer science. Before computer science was a major in itself, it was actually a collection of mathematics, philosophy, electrical engineering, and a bunch of different subdisciplines. So philosophy is there in its roots.
All right. So is there any particular questions or research projects you're interested in that field?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, before I really get into it, I guess I want to take another look at human beings. So one of the things that are the most interesting and most unique about us, actually, is our ability to use language. Like every other biological organism, we pass down information through DNA. So a spider learns how to spin its web through the DNA that's passed down. But human beings are unique in that we can teach all of our offspring any skills that we've learned. Now, what's different about us also is that we use tools. I want to go on the air and say human beings might not be the most intelligent species on the planet. I mean, actually, even compared to whales and dolphins, we might fall behind. The difference is that for human beings, we actually use tools to manipulate our environment. So we're intelligent tool-using animals. But I want to, maybe let everyone take a second to think about the incredible things that human beings have done, which is, hospitals, cities, transportation, the internet. And compared to every other animal on Earth, it's really difficult for us to see the intelligent behavior of those species. But I really want to go into how horrible human beings can be at reasoning from time to time. It can get pretty bad. So the three things that philosophers, logicians, and swindlers have cataloged throughout time are really fallacies, cognitive biases, and heuristics. And I'm going to briefly go over each one. So fallacies are defects in arguments that have become so common that they're given a name to be more easily identifiable.
What are some common logical fallacies?
The one I wanted to talk about, I guess, because it's just really interesting, and it's really hard to get around because it's buried deep into human psychology, into our very framework of our mind. It's often called the Texas sharpshooter's fallacy. So it gets its name because if you can imagine a sharpshooter, someone with a gun and or pellets, and they're firing at a barn, they're going to leave a bunch of holes all over the side of this barn. Now, if he happens to shoot an area and he shoots it a lot, and then he paints a bullseye around this area, it's going to look like to someone passing by that he's a really good shot because he painted a bullseye where he happened to be shooting the entire time. But really, he wasn't shooting for the bullseye in the first place. It just happened to be there. So, I mean, how this relates to human beings is whenever we see a pattern, whenever we see coincidences, our mind automatically throws meaning over that entire context. To give you an example, I mean, Nostradamus made hundreds of predictions, and some of them talk about a person named Hister. And when you get into it, it almost sounds like he's making predictions about certain politicians and famines and all these different world wars, but what we're doing is applying what we know in our context right now to the situation of a guy 400 years ago, and we're applying meaning to these two things when they're totally and completely unrelated.
So earlier when you mentioned AIs and humans using tools, do you think AIs can circumvent that issue, or the sharpshooter fallacy?
I do. I mean, the problem with the sharpshooter's fallacy is that it's also inherent in how we recognize patterns. When we program computers, we can potentially program them to avoid this kind of fallacy. It's just inherent in the way that we do things, but we can separate that out. I mean, the other issue that we have is also confirmation bias. This is a cognitive bias, which is separate from a fallacy. It's the way that we interpret information based on our own experiences. So, I mean, if you're arguing with someone, you'll recognize this like right off the bat. You know, you seem to present this evidence that clearly refutes them, that totally disproves them, but they brush it off and say, like, no, that's not really like what's going on. That doesn't apply to what I'm saying, even though it does. But when they bring up a point of their own, or when you say something that seems to support their view, they'll jump on it and they'll say, yeah, that's right, that proves me. But that's the confirmation bias, to see even a little evidence to support you and ignore a lot of sweeping evidence. What human beings have done to circumvent that is to basically invent the scientific method. And the scientific method is all about eliminating confirmation bias and the Texas sharpshooter's fallacy. And I believe that we can program the scientific method into a computer, into a program, so that it can avoid these entirely all the time. I mean, one of the ways that the scientific method will do this is that you come up with a hypothesis, and then you don't try to support it. What you try to do is to disprove it at every angle. And luckily, humans are still very spiteful, so when someone else comes up with a hypothesis, they're going to try to disprove it as much as possible.
I see. Is there any other common fallacies?
Well, as far as fallacies go and cognitive biases, there's also heuristics. And heuristics are basically, it's a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently. It's something that we've evolved over a long period of time in our evolution. It's pretty much, you take a small amount of data, you take a few examples, and then you extrapolate and you generalize as much as you can to find patterns. One of these is, it's the representativeness heuristic, which is when you meet a person and they're angry for that one day. Maybe you meet your boss and he's angry that day. You might think, oh, Bob is an angry guy. But really, you're not taking into account maybe the situations that are going around. Maybe he's having an especially tough day, or there's some other stressful situation. So you think he's an angry man, but really it's just how he's doing at that time. So you form a sort of false, quick judgment. And then you kind of don't do this for yourself. You're less aware of the social situations that are around you. So, I mean, these things, sometimes they make judgments incredibly accurate and very quick. And that's what they were designed for in nature. But as it stands right now, these can be really harmful if you're looking for the right answer.
So, back to the boss example.
Mm-hmm.
So are you saying a person wouldn't be justified in assuming that the next day maybe they shouldn't try to make their boss mad, or see, like, because maybe the boss is actually angry because he is temperamental. So
no, that's a good point. And that's how a person would act. The problem is you tend to make quick snap-second judgments on a person without really giving them much of a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And now that you know the representativeness heuristic, you should be able to give people more of a chance and see how they act in the long run. But the thing is, you're right, that's how you would act, and that's because that's how we evolved over millions and billions of years. We're social creatures, and we need these kinds of tools in order to get around in the world, make sure we don't die very quickly. But the problem is that we're now dealing with data and science and information that is beyond the scope of the way that we evolved. And we aren't sure how to deal with these things based on the human mind.
So we have these cognitive tools that seem really flawed, logical fallacies, confirmation biases, and stuff like that. How do you feel AIs can circumvent that issue?
Well, I don't want to say that human beings are wrong all the time, that's for sure. I mean, if we were broadly irrational, it might be hard to survive, to get to the car, to build the car. So I think we are absolutely exemplary in the good reasoning that we do. And what we need to do is make sure that we do that good reasoning as much as possible. So, I mean, it's the same as doing a math problem, but we need to do it right every time. And that's what we're trying to do with computer science and artificial intelligence is, create something that will eliminate the errors that we make while keeping all the precision that we've given it.
Is there any contemporary example of something like that?
Yeah, I didn't want to just talk about how humans are bad and we've got no other options. So, I mean, I think I've given a few points on how humans can be really bad at reasoning, but yeah, I do want to go over how artificial intelligence and machines can do really well. Um, I mean, part of this is that it might be the case, and this is the scary one, that human beings are so deeply ingrained with these cognitive biases, with all these problems and logic errors, that it'll take far too long and too much effort to get them out of our systems and think differently than it is to really create something that doesn't have these flaws in the first place. And a lot of people out there, I'm sure, are probably thinking that, okay, well, machines are going to be inherently flawed because they are created by humans, and machines can only do what their programmers thought that they could do. And there's actually some examples from quite a while ago. Way back, even over 40 years ago, there was a programmer, Arthur Lee Samuel. He was an American artificial intelligence expert, one of the first. And what he did is he just wanted to play checkers. And he just wanted someone who could play checkers. And he thought this would be a really good problem to program. Now, the problem is he wasn't really a good checkers player himself. So what he did is he designed a program to play checkers, and he designed it to learn from all the games that it would play. So at first, Arthur Lee Samuel, he played the computer, he beat the computer, and he beat it every time. So what he did is he thought, okay, well, what if it just needs to play more games? What if it just needs to learn? So he had the computer play against itself. And, even against, you'd think that computers are much faster than us, but our human minds are actually incredibly fast in terms of computation. But regardless, the computer ended up playing thousands of checkers games against itself. It would play thousands and thousands of games. And what it did is, when it beat itself, every time there was a winning game, which is every time, it would memorize all the steps and every move that checkers game played. And then when it would play Arthur again, and when he would play checkers, he found that he couldn't beat this program at all. The problem is that every move that Arthur made, that computer had played against itself, and it had remembered the move, and it remembered all the moves that would lead to a victory. And so it simply played out from memory what the best game was, with the best possible solution.
So is that where AI is headed, having computer AIs that kind of self-simulate 1,000 times and then they'll like perfect methods?
That is one direction that it's moving. But there's tons of ways that it can go. So, I mean, there's a few problems with that. Checkers is a limited game. There's only so many checkers games you can play. And now when you take a look at a game like chess, where we've tried to simulate computers, for a while we had a lot of difficulty, because if you actually do it the math, it's something crazy. Like, there are more possible chess games than there are atoms in the universe. It's really absurd. So the algorithm that we had for the checkers example was to play every game possible and then search for that game. For chess, we do something similar, where we have a computer play all these games, but we still found that the computation that you have to do, the memory that you have to have, it's even almost too much for a computer. So we kind of have to move beyond this kind of method of search every possibility and go from there. You might have heard that we had a human grand champion for chess. His name was Kasparov, and we invented a computer called Deep Blue. And Deep Blue actually won a series of matches against Kasparov, and this was the first time that a program had actually beaten a human champion. The way that they did it, though, is kind of cheating. It's almost not fair, but they had several grandmasters who were helping the programmers program Deep Blue. And what they did is they had these champions given their best input for what the best starting match is. Then there's the mid-game, of course, end-game, special tactics. So it was using different programs and different algorithms for each and every part of the game.
So for that circumstance, when it comes to chess, it does depend on the programmer's knowledge then, because the programmer was having other champions help them program the AI for Deep Blue.
It does. these are what are called expert systems. And expert systems are our attempt to take, what experts we have in the human world and gather their information and apply it algorithmically. And an algorithm is just a series of steps to solve a problem. To apply that algorithmically and make it repeatable. So getting into that, actually, these might seem like places where the computers are still within the scope of what the programmers have done. I want to talk a little bit about Watson. Watson was a computer that was developed, a program that was developed in 2011, and it was actually specifically designed to play the game show called Jeopardy!
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about Jeopardy! Is that it is actually really complex. If you've ever tried to follow along with the show, there are tons of hints and word plays, and just it takes a vast knowledge to really do well at Jeopardy! And so what we wanted to do is we didn't want to just test against regular contestants. We wanted to see what it could do against the very best. The two best players that we've ever had on Jeopardy! Who've won consecutive shows again and again is Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. And so what we did is in 2011 we had Watson compete against these two people on Jeopardy! And Watson completely smashed the competition. It was an incredible display. Watson was able to answer these questions that were posed in natural language, which is basically how you would ask the question. What it would do is that it had, I don't know if you will think this is fair, but I don't want to say it had access to the internet, but it had a snapshot of the internet. So it wasn't connected online, but what it did was it had full access to pages and pages of the internet, like terabytes of data. It also had all of Wikipedia on its side. And it was in various sorted and unsorted data, but it would search through all this information to find a possible answer. And what it would do is it would have about 3 options, which it calculated were probably it. So, I mean, like, an example question would probably be like, what does a person ride that has 2 wheels and a seat? Even that kind of basic question might be very hard for a program because you have a basic definition, but you have to link all these concepts and find the right answer. But Watson would probably respond bicycle. So they tweaked this program, and eventually it became very successful, and it won the $1 million prize on Jeopardy!
Oh, wow. Was it programmed to know what to do with that $1 million prize?
Good question. I'm really curious what it did. Actually, Watson moved on to medicine. Early in February of 2013, Watson was actually successfully implemented into lung cancer treatment centers. So, and last I heard, over 90% of the nurses began taking its information on what it should do about patients. So this is one case where we take expert systems, like even doctors, and we can implement all the information that they have, input data, and Watson will return, potentially what's going on with the patient, what the correct diagnosis is.
Wow, what medical school did Watson go to?
That's a good question. I'll have to ask IBM that.
No, I'm just playing. So, it seems like, though, earlier you said some people might say that's cheating, though, to kind of have, like, screenshots of all these pages.
Right.
Doesn't it just feel like Watson is just as someone with a greater memory, huge memory base, as opposed to other players?
That's true. It is really tough to say, are these things fair? Is it comparable to say with the snapshot of the internet what it's like to be a human mind? I want to say that the jury is still out. There are, different views on how much memory and information the human mind can handle. So it could be the case that maybe the human players were actually, doing far better than Watson. But Watson was very specialized in the memory that it had. So, I mean, it's tough to say at this point.
Now, I'm presuming Watson doesn't have the ability to, like, hold a conversation or have personality. Is that correct?
Yeah, no personality right now. One of the issues that it has is that the ability to listen to language and to interpret it on the spot is actually incredible. We still haven't figured it out quite yet. So what Watson was doing was, while the human players would have to listen to Alex Trebek kind of drone on, and you'd have to, read the questions to them, at the same time, Watson would be getting a digital text version of the question. So it was just letters, and it would be fed into Watson. So Watson wasn't actually listening to Alex Trebek or any of the hosts, talk about the questions. It could only handle information through text. What the future might hold, though, is, this is kind of why I would suggest, you might want to get out of the customer service industry, is that Siri is on the iPhone, and there's tons of different apps and everything that will listen to human natural language and will respond to you. So, you can actually go on, and this is really cool, but if you have certain apps on your phone, you can say, Siri, what planes are overhead above me right now? And Siri will tell you the exact planes that are overhead you, that are flying like in the sky at that given moment. So that's an incredible thing, to know what you want and how to get it. So if we can bridge Watson and Siri, there's a chance that with natural language and being able to turn that into text and results, there's a chance that Watson would be able to speak to people. And if that's the case, then you might have, every time you call in for customer service, a person that's always there 24 hours, never takes a break, never needs to sleep, never gets impatient, and never knows the wrong answer. So it's going to be a really strange workforce that we're going to have in the future.
Wow. So why haven't we bridged that gap yet? You would think by now someone would combine Watson and Siri and make a Watson Siri.
You think? Yeah. Perhaps, like a multi-gender or some kind of program. It's definitely in the works. I'm sure there's definitely some prototypes out there. But, this is one case where we're trying to get human-computer interaction, and we're dealing with things that are purely data. There's definitely some things out there that we think that might be integral to humanity. So René Descartes was a famous philosopher in the 16th and 17th century, and he was one of the first people to believe in souls, and to really, he was one of the first people to really defend souls and defend this kind of dualist double perspective. There's the mind, and then there's physical substance that we constantly deal with. And one of the things that he held that was integral to humanity, that was integral to the rational mind, is the ability to do mathematics.
Well, I guess we have calculators, so.
Yeah. Yeah, usually, when you're sitting in class and you hear that, you look down at your phone or your calculator and you're like, well. But it is an interesting thing, because one of the things that people aren't often acquainted with is, while there's number crunching, which is calculation, there's actually also proofs in mathematics. There's axioms, which are supposed to be, an axiom is supposed to be a self-evident truth. And you sort of build these up like Lego blocks, and you keep building and building. And it involves a lot of what feels like intuition. It involves a lot of what, this seems right. And it's really tough to get a computer or a program to do those kinds of things, to have intuition. So a lot of people have said, okay, we have calculators, but they can't do real mathematics. They can't do what we really need them to do that'll make progress. Okay, so whenever somebody says computers can't do this, you can bet that there's definitely teams of researchers who are trying to absolutely not do that, to absolutely prove that computers can, in fact, do that for sure.
So was there any researchers that managed to create a math program that actually did do proofs? Because that would pretty much put every math major who wants to do research out of business.
It's funny, you would think that. So there are tons of programs right now that what they're called is computer-assisted proofs, and they've developed different proofs. One that I'll talk about today, it's I won't get into the gory details of it, but it's called the Robbins conjecture. And this was developed way back in 1933. And basically what it talks about is it's a question: are all Robbins algebras Boolean? So Robbins algebra was really basic. I mean, if you can think of just like plus and minus, that's the kind of things that it was dealing with. And then it's asking if it's Boolean or not. And Boolean really just means two values. So we can think of it as kind of like true or false. So Robbins made a conjecture about all these systems, and it seemed to be true, but there was no way to prove that it related back to itself, that it related to whether the Robin conjecture, whether Robin's algebras are Boolean. And a lot of work was done on this. For over 60 years, mathematicians and logicians were kind of confounded by this. They weren't able to find a proof that would solve this Robin's conjecture. But so as you can expect, I mean, you know where the story is going. In October 10th of 1996, there was a program that was called EQP, or the Equational Prover. And what it did is it actually solved this theorem after a couple days. And it did it in about, I think it's under 20 lines. But the problem, of course, you know, we have this machine now that's proved this thing, but just like humans, mathematicians won't believe it until they get some checking to make sure that there's no mistakes, no tricky little things. And what they found was that, as you might expect, with the computer, the proof that it printed out was almost unreadable. There was almost no way to read it for a human mind. It involved tons of substitutions and tons of tricky substitutions that a human mind not be able to think about or grasp immediately. So even some of our smartest weren't able to make these substitutions because they just resulted in these horribly ugly, very long lines of confusion. And so even though it produced this proof that was very succinct, it took months and months before it was officially taken to be true. So these are the kind of issues that we have is, mathematicians have said, okay, well, you have these computer-assisted proofs, but you can't really have a computer that does proofs on its own. It has to be verified by human hand because these computers have defects in their programming. They have defects in their hardware and software. And so you're always going to have something that we can't trust like we can trust human reason.
So it sounds like, to some degree, humans have their own flaws and their strengths, but computers also have their own flaws and strengths. So it's just kind of like this codependency between humans and computers.
There is a codependency for now, except computers could probably evolve much more rapidly. Yeah, I want to say for now. It's funny. I think Brad Rutter, when he lost against Watson on Jeopardy, he said, "Well, I welcome our new robot overlords." So it's like there is this kind of view that like, wow, they're moving so quickly, it might push us out, but. I mean, even with these computer-assisted proofs, there's something to be thought about, and it is, what if computers advance to such a stage where, the human mind isn't able to understand what these computers produce? So there could be a complex scientific equation that's been solved, and it's computers are often used in biology and chemistry and physics. So inside the cell, a computer might be able to spit out, a perfect detailing of the Krebs cycle, but given to a human, there's no way for us to understand what it's doing and no way for us to really verify. So I think that's a scary level that we're going to get to, but that I want to push towards is we need to get to a level where maybe the humans and computers can interact with each other, but computers might reach conclusions that the human mind just isn't capable of understanding.
So at some point, the human mind's going to become obsolete.
I mean, that's something I really want people to think about is there's kind of two schools of thought within philosophy and artificial intelligence. There's, at this point in the show, I should say what artificial intelligence might be. So artificial intelligence is a program or a machine that simulates what we believe to be intelligent behavior. So we're creating something based on our own definition of intelligence. And there's something called average general intelligence or artificial general intelligence. And that's kind of the ability to take data that you know and apply it to new problems. And human beings do this all the time. We always come across new things that we've never really dealt with before, but we use patterns and things that we've used in the past to solve that new problem. We're still a little bit of ways away, I would say, from getting average general intelligence or artificial general intelligence. But we can make something that is like humans, that we can interact with. We can make something that has artificial intelligence just like a human mind, I think. But is that even what we want to go for? Do we want to make something that has potentially all the flaws that we do and limit it I guess to keep it on our level, or can we, create a new life form, create a new artificial intelligence that far surpasses and maybe even leaves the human mind behind?
So earlier you were mentioning that people were trying to figure out, okay, the difference between the human mind and artificial intelligence is this. And then later on they're shown wrong. No, computers can do math. And then people are like, well, they can't do real math. And then the computer ends up proving some mathematical theorem.
Right.
Some people actually have brought up that computers can't have one thing, and that thing is consciousness. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's true?
This is a tough case. So, and this is definitely where philosophy kind of shines through. You can't really talk about consciousness and philosophy and artificial intelligence without not bringing out the Turing Test. So the Turing Test is a really famous test case that Alan Turing, who was a great mathematician and one of the first computer scientists, he felt strongly about machines, being intelligent agents, being these things that had a life of their own and that we should respect. And so there used to be this game where you had a male and a female, and they were separated into different rooms, and, you might knock on the door and you might ask, like, okay, answer me these questions. And the point of the game was that at the end, you would have to determine who is the male and who is the female. So Turing kind of spread this out, and he said, what we should do is we should separate a computer in one room and a person, an actual live person, in the other, and then we'll have someone who can speak to both of them. And at the end of it, this person should be able to tell, who's the person, who's the computer. And if they guess wrong, if they guess that the computer is an actual person, then that computer should be regarded as being intelligent. So this is like a really tricky example. And, at first, okay, well, if the person's fooled, what does that really mean? Like, why should we consider that person is, that machine is intelligent? The tricky part comes in that how do you really know that another person is conscious? So this is a problem maybe people haven't thought about before, but you can immediately tell in your own mind that you have consciousness. At least you think you do. You feel things, you feel emotions. But, like, say you look down and you see a cockroach with one leg and it's wiggling and it appears to be in pain and it appears to be, afraid for its life. But we know now that cockroach has a nervous system that's very limited. It's possible that it's just reacting in this kind of physical, chemical way, and there's no real feeling there. If you bring that up to a human being, it seems like we could never, ever tell, even looking at the brain, whether a person is thinking or feeling in the same way that we are. So we're faced with this problem, and, with the most common sense answer, you have to say, yeah, I know that this other person is conscious. I know they're not really just some kind of meat robot. But one of the ways and one of the average tests that we have is to speak to that person, to hear their thoughts, to hear their reasoning, to ask them how they feel. And from there, we just agree, okay, well, this person sounds like how I would sound, so I'm pretty sure they're conscious because I'm conscious. And that's kind of like the argument that we follow when we try to prove other human beings have consciousness and intelligence. So Turing is kind of saying, well, look, this is the benchmark that we use for other human beings. But why can't we just apply this benchmark to machines as well? So a lot of people find this argument extremely convincing, and they say, yeah, if we can trick somebody, if you can interact with something, and this is kind of the standard that we use for human beings, we should apply the same standard and not be biased to machines. So as you can expect, we've had a lot of difficulty with this problem for a really, really long time. And there's tons of research teams that have gotten together to try to beat this. And actually, it was really recent, back in February of 2013, just early a couple of years ago, we created a computer program, and it was developed to imitate a 13-year-old boy. And it was actually a 4 and 13-year-old boy. So you can imagine, any defects in grammar or English, people might excuse because they're like, okay, well, he doesn't really speak English that well. And his name was Eugene Goostman. And basically what they had is people at a university who would come and they would kind of interact with this person, and it would be like they were chatting online. Like it was just like a chatting.
Chatting online with a 13-year-old boy?
Yeah, yeah. Nothing wrong can go there. So, I mean, yeah, he was just, he would just chat and just ask him about America or ask him about London and, wherever they were. And what they found is that they managed to convince 33% of the judges that it was human. So 33% doesn't sound like a lot, but what we set as the goal was at least 30%. So it surpassed our goal. So what they said is that, maybe we need to consider Eugene Gooseman, this little boy, as having intelligence. But for me personally, while this is a really big milestone about what we think artificial intelligence should be and how we can, speak to people and be sure of consciousness, I think that this is really a case of what we call in philosophy, it's contextualism. So what we said is, in everyday life, when we talk to a person, we assume that they're conscious because we can talk to them, we get their emotions, their reasoning. But that's the context that we're in. So let me give you another example. In everyday life, we say we know things. We know it for a fact. Like, where are your keys? Well, I put them on the table so I know that they're there. How do I know this table exists? Well, I can observe it, and I'm pretty right in the past, so it must be true. But I mean, if you change the context to something a little more difficult, like let's say you have like a 3 or 4 year old running around the house who's a kleptomaniac, and you say you put your watch on the table, and then if I ask you, do you know your watch is on the table? Do you remember putting it there? You might say, no, I don't know it for a fact because this little 3 or 4 year old, he might have taken my watch. Or even in another situation where you might be feeling a little bit out of it is, do I know that this table's here? Well, I need to stop and think that I'm dreaming for a second. And you do maybe a few checks to see if you're dreaming. So when we say that we know things, we think about the context we're in. We think about how we're feeling at that moment. And then we have certain standards of what we agree. Like, okay, well, I only need this much justification. I only need this many reasons to think that this is true. So I think that's kind of the case that we have with the Turing test is we have this level of contextualism where, given the context, we normally think that if someone can speak and think, and then they must be feeling, they must be conscious, they must be intelligent. But I think that we need to kind of set our context a little higher, that we're thinking too low, and you need to have more and better standards for that.
Yeah, because what if a computer was specialized with some algorithms to interact, and that was it? All it do, like it was. I'm assuming Eugene Gooseman, the 13-year-old computer program, like all it can do is just hold a conversation, and that's it.
Exactly, yeah. And so it can't handle new situations like we would expect a human being to. So in a weird way, it's kind of like those really annoying voicemails where, you call somebody. Yeah, and then you get the voicemail and they're like, oh, hey, what's up, man? Oh, what's going on? And you're talking a little bit and they're like, yeah. And they're like, okay, this is my voicemail. Leave a message. And you get really upset.
Do you do that?
I do. I am that person. I'm the mean guy.
Oh, man.
Because it's really funny. But, we could have kind of these potential situations where you kind of accidentally fall into thinking that this is a person. But they try to kind of circumscribe this by making the Turing test a little stronger. You have to have a little bit of a lengthy conversation. You have to talk about a few topics to kind of get a really good feel. So
now, what's interesting is that if you keep raising the standard, what if, let's say, for example, there's a kid in school that's autistic, and you try to apply this Turing test to that kid. It feels like, to some degree, maybe the kid might just fail that Turing test, and then suddenly we're classifying human beings as non-humans.
No, you're a smart guy, Walter. I think that's a really, really good counterexample. Is with an autistic children, or maybe someone who's mentally challenged or has any other kind of disability, say even a mute person. If this is our standard for judging someone as intelligent, it might not be that good because we're going to eliminate a lot of people. What I think someone who supports the Turing test would say is that this is just one method that we can use to test intelligence, and there should be several that we can use. But if it can pass at least this one, then we can assume that it's at least somewhat intelligent. But like I said, I don't know if I want to buy it. But it really just comes down to also how people view intelligence and how they view machines. So there's very famous researchers on this. They've written basically the textbook on artificial intelligence. It's Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, and they present this example. It's when you ask the question, "Can machines fly?" The answer is yes, because airplanes fly. When you ask, "Can machines swim?" The answer is no, because submarines don't swim. And when you ask, "Can machines think?" is this the question like the first or like the second? So is can machines think like can machines swim? So actually, there's Edgar Dijkstra. He agrees that some people would kind of say the question whether machines can think is as relevant as the question of whether submarines can swim. And I think this is a point you really need to think about. We're asking whether machines can be conscious and whether they can think, but what does it mean to think? What does it mean to be this thinking thing? And that's a really deep philosophical question that we'll need to answer. So, there's something about swimming that we want to say submarines can't swim. But, other people have argued that this person named Drew McDermott, when we were talking about Deep Blue with the chess champion, he said, if you're going to say that Deep Blue isn't thinking, he's saying about chess, it's like saying that an airplane doesn't really fly because it doesn't flap its wings. So, it really depends on how we want to think and how we want to define what thinking is. If you simply go into creating intelligent behavior, the question of whether these machines can think really isn't that important, because that's not what you're creating it to do. And that's not what we're asking for. But what you want to say is, if we go in to this program and we're thinking, I want to create a thinking machine, that's where we're going to run into a lot of problems. That's where we really have to think, what does it mean? What does it mean to really think?
So is it more like levels of thinking, where a chess computer can think only when relevant to chess, but if you really want to create an actual conscious AI, you want a computer that can think about anything, that can adapt to situations, can do math, can play video games, can hold a conversation, even play an instrument.
Right. No, yeah, that's going back to artificial general intelligence. That's one thing that we want to create. And that's a really good point. One thing that I wanted to talk about, it's still hard to talk about because it's such a fledgling theory. It's still in its infant stages. We need to get used to this, but it's called integrated information theory. And it's a proposed theoretical framework, and it was invented by a neuroscientist named Julio Tononi. And it's basically to explain the nature of consciousness. So what he was doing is, consciousness is this incredible thing. It's what makes us feel, and it's what we have. Arguably, it's the number one sense that we have. We have the most direct interaction with this thing. While you can say maybe we're in the Matrix and we're not really smelling flowers like the movie, but we're not really seeing objects, but no matter what, it seems like we're getting these conscious feelings of things, and you can't deny your thoughts. So it's really weird to think that every night when you go to sleep, this consciousness thing, this thing shuts off, until you dream or until you wake up. It just completely shuts down. And, philosophers and scientists are still confounded about this. Like, why does this happen? Why does it stop? Why does it go away? How does it just come back on out of nowhere? So Dr. Tononi, he was going for surgery, and he was really interested to do this experiment when he was going under anesthesia. It's like, what does it feel like to be under anesthesia? And what he really started getting from his experiments is that what consciousness is really just integrated information. So it lends itself a lot from information theory, and I'm a little biased here because it does come from computer science, but you can run an equation on a hardware system, so like your computer. And let's say like you have a network, so you've got 7 computers hooked up to each other. They got cables going everywhere, in and out. You can run some tests and perform a calculation, and you can determine how integrated these systems are. So how much they share resources, how much they share data. So what Dr. Tononi is saying is what we should do is we should run a similar kind of calculation on the human mind. We can talk about how integrated information is, and he's arguing something very radical and something very cool. You should be able to run a calculation on any system that exhibits intelligent behavior, and you should be able to find an actual, maybe a number of how conscious this being is. So that's really crazy to think, is can you take a, maybe like a urine sample? I don't know, like you can, measure somebody's food intake or oxygen that they use, measure how much energy the brain is using, and then you can spit out, okay, well, you happen to be 1005 conscious.
It's like, how conscious are you?
Yeah, no,
Find
exactly.
out today.
No, it's really interesting stuff. So maybe that is something that we could point out is how conscious is a fetus, how conscious is a baby, or maybe an autistic person, or anyone really. Is the average person less or more conscious than the other? In the future, we might be able to run this calculation, and what they're calling it is this consciousness level is phi. So if we can just measure phi, we can see how integrated this information is. And we'll be able to tell, is a machine conscious? Well, let's run this calculation. Is this human still conscious? Let's run this calculation and we'll see. So it might be the case, and what they want to say is, it might be the case that some computers and some programs that we have become so integrated that it's possible that they do have very, very low levels of phi. There might be some consciousness in these computers and in these programs, and it could be very measurable.
So where would we set the standard for phi, though? Would it be the average human's phi? That would be the standard for determining whether something's conscious?
We'll probably use some standard like an average human. That's what I want to say, it'd be nice to get more research on this, and if you want to get more personally interested. But what it is it's how integrated the system is. And so we still don't know how phi will really work. We don't have that equation. We don't have that system that we can run that says, all right, this level of consciousness. That's far in the future once we've really worked things out more. But there are some interesting points for the theory, and a little bit of rebuttals, like some counterexamples to the theory. But I mean, one thing that we can talk about is if we fire an electromagnetic pulse into the human brain, and it's this really strong magnetic pulse, what we see is that the entire brain reacts. The entire thing. So even though it starts in one small area, it kind of ricochets throughout the brain and activates all these things. Now, that's a really integrated system where all the smaller parts are interacting with each other and constantly, exchanging information. So what we might expect is that when you don't feel conscious, there isn't that level of integration. So we fired magnetic pulses into unconscious people, and we found that it reacts kind of how this theory would predict, is that the brain doesn't light up. It doesn't ricochet. It lights up in this very small sector and then it kind of dies down. So that's one example where it's like, wow, okay, so we've made a prediction. We made a prediction that people aren't very conscious when they're unconscious, and their systems aren't very integrated during that time. You might have seen a movie called Lucy, where recently, it was Scarlett Johansson, and it talks about using 100% of your brain. So some people have thought about that, like maybe if we used every single neuron and we all fired them all and we could perform some incredible computation, we could be super conscious. But what people don't know is this actually does happen. In patients who have epilepsy and anyone who experiences a seizure, what's going on in the brain during a seizure is that every neuron is synchronized. They're not firing on their own. They're firing all at once. They go on and off, on and off. And it gets into a really steady rhythm. And people kind of seize, and we have all these weird situations. But what we'd expect if this were not the case, if we were just going off of, neuron use and firing, we would expect that these seizures would cause people to be super conscious, that they would suddenly get way more feeling. But what we found is that when when people are having seizures, they're totally unconscious. They don't remember the experience. They don't know what's going on. They're not feeling anything. And that's actually also a prediction by this theory, is that their system isn't integrated at all. It's all on or it's all off. There's no complex interaction going on, so there should be no consciousness. So, I mean, these are kind of the things, the experiments and, thought ideas that really support this integrated information theory by Dr. Julio Tononi.
Thank you. Do you have any closing remarks or any interesting points?
I just want to say, I mean, there's no telling what the future will bring. We still have a lot to do with artificial intelligence. We still have a lot to develop. But it's going to be coming whether you like it or not. And I would just say keep an eye out and kind of think about these things. How are you going to feel when maybe 50% of the interactions that you have are with only machines? So, but thank you for having me on your show, Walter.
Thank you. That concludes our interview, and we'll be closing with some music. See you guys next week.